The brutal August of 1848 descended upon Virginia's Tidewater region, with a heat that seemed to rise from the rivers and swamps themselves. Humidity so dense it condensed on skin like invisible rain and made breathing feel like drawing liquid into lungs rather than air, creating conditions that transformed even minimal exertion into genuine physical ordeal, while simultaneously demonstrating why this coastal region had earned its reputation as one of the most ancient centers of American slavery, where the institution had been practiced and perfected across more than 2 centuries since the first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619. Where generations of slaveholding families had developed elaborate systems of control refined through centuries of experience, and where the mechanisms of domination had achieved a kind of terrible efficiency that combined systematic violence with comprehensive surveillance and with ideological justifications that allowed slaveholders to maintain their power with confidence, born from centuries of essentially unchallenged authority. In the slave quarters of Riverside Plantation, situated along the James River, where generations of the Cavendish family had accumulated substantial wealth through tobacco cultivation that had exhausted the soil decades earlier, but that continued through heavy fertilization and intensive labor. Extracted from approximately 60 enslaved people whose work sustained the family's position among the Tidewater's established planter aristocracy, even as economic realities pushed Virginia increasingly toward becoming an exporter of enslaved people to feed the Deep South's cotton boom rather than a center of profitable agricultural production. Field workers gathered in the evening darkness when temperatures finally dropped to merely oppressive levels and spoke in voices that carried both profound fascination and considerable wariness about an extraordinary situation that had been persisting for nearly 3 years concerning a man whose presence at Riverside had fundamentally altered the plantation's power dynamics in ways that seemed to challenge every assumption they held about how slavery actually functioned beneath the surface of legal doctrines and public performances that claimed the system's authority was absolute and unchallengeable. According to accounts that were preserved with remarkable consistency across multiple generations in oral histories maintained by descendants of enslaved people who had witnessed events directly and who recognized that what they were observing represented something genuinely unprecedented, that provided both inspiration about resistance possibilities and caution about the exceptional circumstances that made such resistance viable. A man named Juma, who stood 7 feet and 6 inches tall according to measurements that multiple witnesses confirmed, and whose physical presence was so imposing that he literally dominated any space he occupied in ways that created visceral reactions in everyone who encountered him regardless of their expectations or intentions, had arrived at Riverside in October of 1845 after being purchased by plantation owner Richard Cavendish from an estate sale in North Carolina, under circumstances suggesting that the previous owners had been willing to sell someone of obvious physical capabilities and economic value at a price that Cavendish considered remarkably favorable because Juma's history across multiple ownerships suggested management difficulties that had led previous slaveholders to conclude that whatever labor value his size and strength represented was outweighed by complications that his presence created for normal plantation operations. From the moment of Juma's arrival at Riverside, the initial weeks and months had proceeded according to patterns that everyone recognized from decades of observing how newly acquired enslaved people were integrated into plantation operations. Assignment to field work under the supervision of head overseer Thomas Morrison, who had managed Riverside labor force for nearly 20 years and who had established a reputation throughout the Tidewater as someone particularly skilled at breaking resistant workers through combinations of calculated violence and psychological intimidation that made even the strongest eventually submit to the absolute authority that slavery claimed. Establishment of routines demonstrating total control over every aspect of existence from before sunrise until after dark, and the constant omnipresent threat of whipping or other physical punishment that could be inflicted at any moment for any infraction, whether real or fabricated, that overseers determined required correction to maintain the psychological dominance that the system depended upon. But according to remarkably consistent accounts preserved in oral traditions maintained by people who had witnessed events and by their descendants who understood the story's significance, what happened approximately 8 weeks after Juma's arrival would permanently transform power relationships at Riverside in ways that no one involved had anticipated, and that would create a situation persisting for years that challenged fundamental assumptions about slavery's operations. Morrison apparently concluding that Juma's compliance with initial work assignments indicated successful subordination and that the moment had arrived to reinforce that subordination through ritualistic violence establishing long-term psychological control, ordered Juma to present himself for whipping on charges that multiple witnesses described as either completely fabricated or grossly disproportionate to whatever minor infraction might have actually occurred. The specific justification mattered far less than the underlying purpose of demonstrating through physical violation and forced submission that size provided no protection whatsoever from violence that slavery could inflict, whenever overseers determined such violence would serve the system's requirements for maintaining absolute dominance. What happened next became the subject of stories told and retold across generations, with such consistency in essential details that the account's reliability seems beyond reasonable question, despite obvious incentives that different parties would have had to shape narratives according to their own interests and perspectives. Juma, ordered to remove his shirt and position himself for whipping in the ritual that everyone present had witnessed countless times before, and that represented one of slavery's most fundamental ceremonies of domination and subordination, instead straightened to his full imposing height that made him physically tower over Morrison and every other person present in ways that created a visual reality, contradicting the power relationships that slavery insisted were absolute. Turned slowly and deliberately to face Morrison directly, rather than positioning himself with back exposed and body bent in the posture of submission that whipping required, and spoke words that multiple witnesses remembered with extraordinary precision because of their shocking directness and complete absence of any verbal deference or submissive tone that slavery demanded Black people maintain when addressing any white person regardless of actual circumstances or personal feelings. He stated, in a voice that carried clearly enough that dozens of enslaved workers heard his words directly, while others learned of them within hours from witnesses, that he would not submit to whipping under any circumstances whatsoever, that any attempt to whip him would result in violence that would end with either his own death fighting or with the death of whoever attempted to inflict such punishment, that he had made an irrevocable decision, that death fighting was preferable to accepting the degradation and violation that whipping represented, and that would establish precedents making future violations inevitable once initial submission had been achieved, and that Morrison and Cavendish needed to understand with absolute clarity that killing him was the only way they would ever succeed in whipping him, because he possessed neither the psychological capacity nor the willingness to submit to ritualistic violence that he considered fundamentally incompatible with maintaining any sense of human dignity or self-respect that made continued existence worth enduring. The challenge was unprecedented in the experience of virtually everyone present at Riverside, and was nearly unprecedented in experiences that people throughout the Tidewater had heard about from other plantations across decades of observation. Enslaved people sometimes resisted punishment through attempts at flight before it could be inflicted, or through passive non-compliance requiring physical force to overcome. But explicit verbal refusal delivered in clear declarative language that threatened lethal violence against anyone attempting to enforce submission was extraordinarily rare because consequences were universally understood to be catastrophic, typically resulting in torture and public execution designed to terrorize entire enslaved communities into absolute submission through graphic demonstrations of what happened to those who dared imagine that resistance to white authority was possible, or that their own dignity was worth defending even at certain cost of death. Morrison, confronted with this challenge before an audience of dozens of enslaved workers whose reactions to what happened next would fundamentally shape power dynamics, not just at Riverside, but potentially at plantations throughout the region as stories inevitably circulated through networks connecting enslaved communities, found himself forced to make an immediate decision about how to respond to defiance that threatened the entire structure of authority his position depended upon, and that challenged assumptions about slavery's absolute power that centuries of Virginia history had seemed to establish beyond any possibility of question. Attempting to whip Juma by force would require summoning assistance from other overseers, and quite possibly from Cavendish himself, and perhaps even from neighboring planters, if the situation escalated beyond what Riverside's white population could manage, would almost certainly result in violence that could kill or seriously injure Morrison, or others attempting to subdue someone whose size and obvious strength and absolute determination to fight to death rather than submit meant that overwhelming force would be necessary, and that even overwhelming force might not prevent casualties among whites if Juma succeeded in killing or disabling several people before finally being overwhelmed through sheer numbers. The situation would create a spectacle witnessed by Riverside's entire enslaved community, and observed by enslaved people at neighboring plantations as stories spread that would either massively reinforce control through brutal demonstration of the costs of resistance if the attempt succeeded without excessive white casualties, or would catastrophically undermine control by demonstrating that even overwhelming force could be effectively resisted, and that slavery's supposedly absolute power was actually constrained by calculations about whether enforcement costs exceeded benefits that submission would provide. Most significantly from Cavendish's perspective, attempting to force submission would risk destroying property worth approximately $1,600 if the violence required to overcome Juma's resistance killed him, or injured him so severely that his capacity for productive labor was permanently impaired, transforming a potentially valuable asset into either a corpse or an invalid who would consume resources without generating economic returns. According to accounts preserved with extraordinary consistency, Morrison made a decision that shocked everyone present. He backed down from the confrontation, claiming in terms that convinced absolutely no one that perhaps punishment could be postponed until a more appropriate time, or that he needed to consult with Cavendish about proper procedures for disciplining someone of Juma's unusual size and evident determination to resist, essentially retreating from enforcing submission in ways that violated every principle about never showing weakness or uncertainty, and always imposing authority immediately and absolutely that overseers were trained to follow, and that slavery's operational requirements seemed to demand. The retreat created immediate and profound reverberations throughout Riverside's enslaved community, as people recognized that something unprecedented had occurred. Someone had openly refused to submit to punishment, had explicitly threatened lethal violence, and had not been immediately crushed, but had instead witnessed the overseer withdraw, while offering face-saving explanations that everyone recognized as transparent fictions, concealing the fundamental concession that Morrison had made by declining to enforce submission. What happened over subsequent days and weeks created a situation that became increasingly difficult to resolve according to slavery's normal logic, and that exposed uncomfortable truths about economic constraints on violence that the system's ideology worked desperately to conceal. Morrison reported the confrontation to Cavendish, explaining Juma's defiance and seeking authorization for assembling whatever force would be necessary to punish him. But Cavendish, according to accounts preserved in oral traditions and according to fragmentary evidence in family correspondence, where he discussed plantation management challenges with relatives who were themselves slaveholders facing similar situations at their own properties, found himself confronting calculations that revealed realities about slavery's power that defenders preferred to keep hidden. Attempting to whip Juma by force would require assembling multiple overseers, and quite possibly recruiting assistance from neighboring plantations. Would almost certainly result in injuries and possibly deaths among those attempting to enforce submission, would risk killing or permanently disabling expensive property, and would create a spectacle that could undermine control even if technically successful, because the level of violence required and the casualties potentially suffered would reveal that slavery's power was not actually unlimited, but was constrained by costs that even brutal slaveholders had to calculate, and sometimes decided were too high to justify paying. The economic calculation that Cavendish was forced to perform, a calculation that he almost certainly wished he didn't have to make explicitly because it revealed foundations of slavery's power that ideology worked to mystify, demonstrated that violence was ultimately bounded by cost-benefit analyses that even the most committed slaveholders had to conduct. Cavendish's decision, made after consultations with Morrison and apparently after at least one direct conversation with Juma, whose content was never documented, but whose outcome became clear through subsequent arrangements, was to establish what amounted to an informal understanding that deviated dramatically from how slavery was supposed to function. Juma would not be whipped for his defiance or for any future infractions, would be assigned to work utilizing his physical capabilities, but would not be subjected to the close supervision and constant threat of violence governing other enslaved people's labor, would be left largely autonomous as long as he maintained productivity levels that Cavendish considered acceptable, and would essentially exist in a category having no formal recognition within slavery's legal structures, but operating as a negotiated arrangement where both parties understood terms, even though such terms could never be openly acknowledged, without undermining the fiction that slavery's absolute power remained intact and unchallenged. This arrangement, shocking in its deviation from slavery's normal operations and fundamentally violating principles about maintaining absolute dominance through constant threat and occasional application of violence, persisted for nearly 3 years from the confrontation, in late 1845 until Juma's death in August of 1848, from causes that accounts variably describe as fever and complications from an injury sustained during fieldwork. Though the specifics of his death remained somewhat unclear, in ways that suggested either genuine uncertainty about medical causes or deliberate vagueness about circumstances that people preferred not to document in detail. During those 3 years, Juma existed in a liminal space that was neither slavery as the system was supposed to function, nor freedom as Virginia law recognized it. He worked because the arrangement required maintaining productivity that made his presence economically valuable to Cavendish. He maintained surface appearances of deference that allowed Cavendish to preserve fictions that proper hierarchies remained operational, but he was fundamentally not subject to the mechanisms of violence and surveillance that constituted slavery's essential nature. The situation created complications extending well beyond Juma's individual circumstances. Other enslaved people at Riverside observed daily that someone had successfully resisted violence and had created relative autonomy, leading to subtle shifts in behavior as people tested whether protective space around Juma might extend to others, or whether similar resistance from those lacking his size and strength would result in catastrophic punishments that slavery typically inflicted on those challenging authority. Morrison and other overseers found themselves navigating dynamics where they had to maintain control over most workers through traditional methods, while carefully avoiding confrontations with Juma that might expose the fundamental concession that Cavendish had made, and that might encourage others to believe resistance was possible. When cost of enforcement could be made high enough that even brutal slaveholders would calculate that submission wasn't worth the price that forcing it would require. The arrangement was never formally acknowledged in plantation records or correspondence that survived, operating instead as an open secret that everyone at Riverside understood, but that no one could discuss openly without undermining elaborate fictions that slavery's absolute power remained intact. The silence in official documentation about a situation persisting for 3 years demonstrates how carefully slaveholders controlled records to exclude anything suggesting the system's power was less than absolute. But the consistency with which the story was preserved in oral traditions demonstrates that enslaved communities recognized the profound significance of what had happened and maintained careful memory of events that official records worked to erase. Juma's death in August 1848 apparently occurred during fieldwork on a day when temperatures reached levels that killed several people throughout the Tidewater. His collapse and death witnessed by multiple workers who described how he simply stopped moving during afternoon heat and died within minutes despite attempts at revival. Cavendish's response revealed complicated economics that had governed the entire situation. He apparently expressed genuine frustration about losing property that had generated substantial value through 3 years of productive labor without requiring intensive supervision and frequent punishment that managing other workers demanded. He recognized that replacing Juma's capabilities through normal market purchases was essentially impossible. And he apparently acknowledged, at least privately, that the arrangement had actually been economically beneficial despite violating every principle about how slavery was supposed to function, because costs avoided by not using violence to force submission exceeded whatever benefits absolute dominance would have provided. The broader significance of what occurred at Riverside between 1845 and 1848 extends beyond specific details to illuminate aspects of slavery's operations that defenders worked to conceal. The story demonstrates that the system's supposedly absolute power was actually constrained by economic calculations about whether enforcement costs exceeded submission's benefits. That under certain circumstances involving specific combinations of physical capability and demonstrated willingness to impose costs that even brutal slaveholders were reluctant to accept, spaces of relative autonomy could be created within a system designed to make such spaces impossible. And that slavery's violence, however brutal, was ultimately bounded by economic realities that ideology worked desperately to mystify. And sometimes, according to legends preserved across generations when official records remained silent, resistance involved neither escape nor death nor submission, but rather something more ambiguous and perhaps more subversive: the creation of liminal spaces where someone stood 7 feet 6 inches tall and demonstrated that death fighting was preferable to ritualistic submission, where a slaveholder calculated that enforcing dominance cost more than tolerating defiance, and where for 3 years an arrangement persisted that everyone understood violated fundamental principles, but that no one could acknowledge without exposing uncomfortable truths about power's limitations. Demonstrating that slavery's violence, however brutal, was ultimately bounded by economic realities that ideology worked to conceal. that even seemingly absolute power involved calculations that could be manipulated when circumstances aligned, and that resistance could take forms challenging the system's logic even when outcomes were neither triumph of escape nor tragedy of death, but rather the complicated persistence of negotiated autonomy within a system designed to make such negotiations impossible. Proving that the absolute power slavery claimed was actually constrained by economic considerations that could be exploited by those with capability and determination to impose costs that even brutal slaveholders ultimately decided were too high to pay for whatever satisfaction forcing submission might provide.